The first time I understood I had been erased. It wasn't in my home, and it wasn't in my son's kitchen with the polite lies and the careful smiles. It was in a courtroom. Room 3B smelled like old paper and burnt coffee. The kind of smell that clings to a building where other people's futures get stamped, filed, and forgotten before lunch. My hands were cuffed to nothing, but they still felt restrained because the bailiff stood close enough to remind me who had permission to move and who didn't. They wheeled me in like I was already a piece of furniture. Not because I needed it. My knees ache, sure, I'm not 25. But I can walk. I can stand. I can take care of myself. The chair wasn't for my body, it was for the picture. My son sat 2 rows behind his attorney posture straight suit, pressed jaw working like he'd practiced this in the mirror. Next to him, my daughter-in-law looked down at her hands as if the lines in her palms were more important than what was about to happen to me. She had a neat folder on her lap. Tabs. Labels. A highlighter clipped to the cover like this was a project, not a life. The judge entered and everyone rose except me. My chair didn't move. I didn't rise. The bailiff didn't even try to help me up. It was a small humiliation. The first of many. Case number, the clerk began. I only caught my name in the middle of it. My full name spoken out loud, clean and official like it still belonged to me. My son's attorney stood and said the words that made my stomach drop. Emergency petition for temporary guardianship. Temporary. That word sounded soft like a blanket being laid over your shoulders. It sounded like concern. It sounded like a promise you could reverse. But in that courtroom, temporary carried teeth. I leaned forward trying to speak. Your Honor. The judge didn't look at me. He looked at the papers. He looked at the attorney. He looked at my son. Mr. Harland, he said, and my son stood immediately. You're requesting authority over your father's medical decisions and his financial affairs. Yes, Your Honor, my son said, voice steady. For his safety. For his safety. Those 3 words landed like a sentence. They always do when someone says them about you instead of to you. I tried again. Your Honor, I don't consent to any of this. I'm fine. I can... The judge held up a hand. Not toward my son, toward me. A quiet stop sign. Sir, he said like he was talking to a child who didn't understand how the world worked. I'm going to ask you a few questions. I answered all of them. My address, the date, the month, the name of the president, the names of my children, where I was, why I was there. My voice didn't shake. My mind didn't drift. I didn't stumble. I watched the judge's face as I spoke, waiting for the moment he would realize the obvious. Instead, he kept reading. He consulted a document and then another as if my words were just noise around the paperwork. The attorney referenced something called an assessment, a report, a note, a professional opinion, a concern. The judge nodded slowly, eyes still down. I saw it then like a door closing. It didn't matter what I said. My son's attorney said, we're requesting immediate placement in an assisted living facility until the situation stabilizes and immediate access to accounts to ensure bills are paid and assets are secured. Immediate access. Access to my money, my home, my signature, my decisions. I felt my throat tighten. Not fear. Something colder. Something I hadn't felt in years. A kind of recognition. This wasn't a family argument that got out of hand. This was a takeover. The judge finally looked at me. Not with curiosity, not with doubt. With a tired procedural patience. Sir, he said, do you understand what's being discussed? I stared at him. What's being discussed, I said, is my son taking my life away. My son's attorney made a soft sound like my statement was inconvenient. My son didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He just stared past me, fixed on the judge's bench like he was watching a clock, like he was waiting for the moment the hand landed on the right number. The judge sighed, glanced at the papers again, and then spoke the words that split my world in half. Based on the petition and supporting documentation, I'm granting temporary guardianship. The room didn't react the way it does in movies. No gasps, no shouts, just pens moving, keys clicking, someone shifting in a chair, a decision made quiet. Temporary guardianship granted. Medical authority transferred. Financial authority transferred. My name's still on the case caption, but my control removed like it was a coat being taken off my shoulders and handed to the man who'd just called himself my protector. I tried to stand. My legs pushed against the footrests of the wheelchair. The bailiff stepped closer. "Please," I said to the judge, and I hated the word as soon as it left my mouth. "Please listen to me." The judge's eyes flicked toward the clerk, toward the next file, the next name, the next life. "Sir," he said, "already done with me, your guardian will make arrangements for your care." Guardian. My son. The bailiff placed a hand on the back of my chair and turned me toward the door. And that's when my son finally moved. He walked down the aisle with the papers in his hand like they were a deed to something new. His attorney whispered to him, smiling the way people smile when they've won clean. My son stopped beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Close enough that he could have looked me in the eye and remembered I was his father. Instead, he leaned down and spoke softly for my ears only. "This is temporary," he said, "just until things stabilize." Then he straightened up, signed something on the clipboard his attorney offered, and handed the pen back like it was no more personal than signing for a package. The bailiff rolled me out. The courtroom door shut behind me with a sound that felt final. In the hallway, my reflection flashed in a glass panel. An old man in a wheelchair he didn't need escorted like a problem that had been solved. I watched that image glide away, and I realized something that made my skin go cold. My son wasn't improvising. He had prepared for this. And whatever came next, it wasn't going to happen to him. It was going to happen to me. They told me it would only be for a little while. That was the phrase everyone used. My son, his wife, the intake coordinator at the facility. Even the social worker who smiled too much and wrote too fast. Just until things stabilize. Stabilize what no one ever quite said. The ride from the courthouse to the facility took less than 20 minutes. Long enough for my son to make 2 phone calls, short enough that I couldn't convince myself this was some kind of misunderstanding that would clear up by the time we arrived. He didn't sit beside me in the transport van. He sat up front next to the driver, speaking quietly, confidently, like a man who knew where he was going and had no intention of turning back. I watched his reflection in the partition glass. He never once looked behind him. The building didn't look like a prison. That was the first trick. Wide windows, neutral colors, a fountain by the entrance that trickled softly as if sound itself had been prescribed to keep people calm. The sign out front said Assisted Living and Memory Care, the words etched in brushed metal, tasteful and reassuring. Inside, the air smelled like disinfectant and something sweet trying to hide it. A woman with a badge met us at the door. She shook my son's hand first. "Mr. Harland," she said, "we've been expecting you." "Not us. Him." She glanced at me only long enough to confirm I matched the paperwork. "This won't be permanent," my son said again, as if repetition could turn it into a fact. "We just want to make sure he's safe while we sort things out." The woman nodded like she'd heard this exact sentence hundreds of times. "Of course," she said. "That's what we're here for." I tried to speak, but my son answered before I could. "He gets confused sometimes," he said casually, "especially under stress." The woman made a note. I hadn't said a word yet, and already my silence was being translated into evidence against me. They took my wallet first, for safekeeping, then my phone, facility policy, then my keys. "You won't need these here." Each item disappeared into a plastic bin with a label that had my name on it printed cleanly, impersonally. I felt lighter with every object removed. Not in a good way. In the way you feel when pieces of yourself are being stripped away and no one asks whether you're ready. My room was small. Bed. Dresser bolted to the wall. A chair by the window that didn't open more than a few inches. "This is just temporary," my son said, standing in the doorway. He didn't come inside. He didn't sit down. He stayed where he could leave easily. I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't conflicted. He was focused. This wasn't an emergency decision. It was a plan reaching its next step. "When do I go home?" I asked. He smiled. Not the smile he used when he was a boy. A careful one. Polished. "Let's see how things go," he said. "We just want to make sure everything's handled properly." Handled. That word followed him out of the room. The door didn't lock. Not technically. But the hallway outside had a code, and I didn't have it. A nurse came in later with a clipboard and asked me a series of questions that had nothing to do with how I felt and everything to do with how I could be categorized. Did I ever forget names? Did I feel anxious? Had I experienced confusion in the last 6 months? Every answer I gave was neutral, reasonable, honest. She nodded politely and wrote anyway. That night, lying in a bed that wasn't mine, I replayed the day backward, looking for the moment I could have stopped it. There wasn't one. Every step had been legal, documented, approved. I understood something then that terrified me more than the locked doors or the missing phone. This system didn't need me to be incompetent. It only needed me to be quiet long enough. And my son was counting on that. He thought time was on his side. He thought I would get tired, confused, compliant. He was wrong about one thing. I wasn't here to wait this out. I was here to watch. The first week passed quietly, too quietly. That's how places like this work. They don't shock you with bars or chains. They smooth the edges. They make everything feel routine, administrative, harmless. You're not being punished. You're being managed. Meals arrived on a schedule I didn't choose. Pills came in small plastic cups I was expected to swallow without questions. Doors opened and closed at times that had nothing to do with my needs. No one raised their voice. No one threatened me, which made it harder to explain what was wrong. On the third morning, a woman from administration knocked on my door. She didn't wait for an answer before stepping inside. She carried a folder, thick, my name typed neatly on the tab. "Good morning," she said, cheerful, professional. "I just need a few signatures from you." I sat up straighter. Signatures for what? She smiled like the question was unnecessary. Just standard intake confirmations. Care acknowledgments. Facility policies. She placed the folder on the table between us and flipped it open, already pointing to the highlighted sections. I read the first page slowly. Authorization for information sharing. The second page. Consent to treatment protocols. The third page. Acknowledgement of guardian authority. I looked up. "I'm not signing anything without my lawyer." Her smile tightened. "Just a fraction." "Your guardian has already approved these," she said. "This is just for our records." "For our records." I closed the folder. "Then your records can wait." She hesitated, clearly not used to resistance. Then she recovered. "I'll let your son know you declined," she said lightly, already standing. "Sometimes residents feel overwhelmed at first." Residents. That word landed heavier than it should have. She left, and an hour later my son called. Or rather, he tried to. The phone rang at the nurse's station, not in my room. A nurse came to get me and stood nearby while I spoke, arms crossed, pretending to organize paperwork. "Dad," my son said, voice calm, practiced. "I heard you refused to sign the intake forms." "I did," I said. "Because I don't agree to them." There was a pause, a controlled one. "You don't need to agree," he said. "I already have the authority." That was the moment. Not the courtroom, not the wheelchair, not the locked hallway. This was the first line he crossed. "You said this was temporary," I said. "You said it was just until things stabilized." "And they will," he replied quickly. "But you're making this harder than it needs to be." "Harder for whom?" "For everyone," he said. "The staff, me, you." I lowered my voice. "When do I get access to my bank account?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I'm handling the bills," he said. "That's part of guardianship." "I didn't ask who was handling them," I said. "I asked when I get access." "You don't need access right now." Right now. I felt something settle into place inside me. A cold understanding. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about care. This was about control. That afternoon, I asked the nurse if I could review my medication list. She frowned, surprised. "Your guardian manages that," she said. I asked if I could call my accountant. "You'll need approval." I asked if I could leave the facility for a walk. "Not without clearance." Each answer was polite, reasonable, procedural. Each one removed another inch of ground beneath my feet. That night I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the building. The carts, the distant television, someone crying 2 rooms down. I thought about all the things my son now controlled. My money, my home, my medical decisions, my signature. And I realized something else. He was moving faster than he needed to. The next morning confirmed it. A courier arrived with documents, not for me, for administration. I recognized the logo on the envelope. My bank. I asked the front desk what it was. Account consolidation, the receptionist said without looking up. Your son requested it. Requested, not discussed, not planned, executed. That afternoon, I overheard two staff members talking near the medication cart. He wants everything streamlined, one said. Yeah, the other replied. He said he doesn't want delays. Delays. I wasn't confused. I wasn't deteriorating. I was inconvenient. That evening, my son visited. He stood at the foot of my bed, hands in his pockets like this was a business meeting he wanted to keep short. I need you to cooperate, he said. No preamble. No concern. With what I asked. With the process, he said. This only works if you don't fight it. Works for whom? He exhaled sharply. Dad, you're not thinking clearly. I looked at him, really looked. You changed the beneficiary on my investment account, I said. He didn't deny it. I reorganized it, he corrected, for efficiency. You locked me out. I protected you. There it was again, that word, protection. I nodded slowly, letting the silence stretch. Do you know what guardianship abuse is? I asked. His eyes flicked up. Just for a second. Don't start, he said. I'm just asking, I replied. Because that's what this looks like. He straightened. Defensive now. I followed the law, he said. I did everything by the book. Then why are you in such a hurry? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. He left soon after, saying he had meetings to attend. That night I made my first decision. If I confronted him, he would tighten his grip. If I protested loudly, he would label me difficult. If I fought openly, the system would close ranks around him. So I stopped. I smiled when staff entered the room. I thanked them for their help. I swallowed the pills without comment. I asked fewer questions. And I listened. Because people talk when they think you've given up. And my son had just shown me his hand. He believed I was trapped. He believed I was isolated. He believed the paperwork had already won. He was wrong about something else. I wasn't confused. I was paying attention. The easiest way to disappear isn't to run. It's to comply. That was the lesson I learned in the weeks that followed. Not because anyone taught it to me, but because the system rewarded it immediately. When I stopped asking questions, doors opened faster. When I smiled, nurses lingered longer. When I nodded, instead of arguing, notes in my file became shorter, kinder, less detailed. Pleasant, one of them wrote once, thinking I couldn't see the screen. Cooperative. Another said tapping the word like it mattered. It did. My son visited less after that. I think my change unsettled him. He had prepared for resistance, confusion, emotional outbursts he could point to and say, "See, this is why." Instead, he found a man who thanked him for stopping by and asked about his work. You seem better, he said one afternoon, standing by the window checking his phone while pretending not to. I'm adjusting, I replied. That wasn't a lie. Adjustment doesn't mean acceptance. It means learning the shape of the cage. Once I stopped being a problem, people forgot I was watching. Staff spoke freely in my room while they changed sheets or adjusted the thermostat. Administrators answered questions they wouldn't have before assuming I wouldn't understand the implications. I asked small, harmless things. What time paperwork was processed? Who handled off-hours approvals? Which emails went through corporate and which stayed in-house? No one thought it was strange. Old men ask questions. That's allowed. What they don't expect is memory. The facility manager introduced herself during a routine check-in. Her badge hung just low enough that I could read her last name. We try to move efficiently here, she said. Families appreciate that. I'm sure my son does, I replied. She laughed. He's very proactive. Proactive. Another soft word with sharp edges. One afternoon during a scheduled call with my son, I noticed something new. He wasn't just confident, he was impatient. They're still processing some things he said irritated. I don't know why it's taking so long. What things, I asked mildly. He hesitated, then waved it off. Administrative stuff. Transfers. Updates. Transfers. He caught himself too late. I didn't react. I didn't push. I let the moment pass like it hadn't mattered. After the call, I asked a nurse if I could use the common room computer. I told her I wanted to read the news. She logged me in herself and left me alone. That was another mistake. Facilities assume isolation protects them. They forget how many systems are still connected to the outside world. It took 3 tries, but I remembered my email password. Most of my accounts were locked, redirected, managed, but one inbox still synced. Buried under automated messages and missed alerts was something out of place. An internal email chain. It wasn't meant for me. It had been forwarded automatically, a setting my son must have overlooked in his hurry. The subject line made my pulse slow, not spike. Fast track intake and documentation. I didn't open it right away. That's another thing people get wrong. They think evidence makes you rush. It doesn't. It makes you careful. I waited until that night when the hallway quieted and the staff rotations thinned. The email wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Family is requesting expedited processing. Guardian wants paperwork finalized before end of month. Please confirm assessment language supports placement and authority. Below it a reply. Understood. Will align documentation accordingly. Let me know if anything needs to be adjusted. Adjusted. No mention of my condition, no concern about my capacity, just alignment, just efficiency, just speed. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark, the glow of the exit sign painting the room red. My son wasn't reacting to my decline. He was racing a clock, and that meant something else was already in motion, something he didn't want delayed. The next morning, I thanked the nurse for breakfast and asked if I could attend the group activity downstairs. She smiled pleased by my participation. While everyone else focused on a game show flickering on the television, I sat near the reception desk listening. Phones rang, voices lowered, names repeated. And then I heard it. My son's name. The facility manager leaned toward the receptionist and said quietly, "He wants confirmation today. He said it's urgent, urgent." I leaned back, closing my eyes, pretending to nap. Inside, everything was sharp. I understood the shape of the plan now. He wasn't waiting for me to deteriorate. He was trying to finish before I could interrupt. And the system was helping him. That was fine. Let him think I was invisible. Invisible men don't get watched, and that's when they learn everything. You learn quickly what kind of place you're in by how people lower their voices. In this facility, voices dropped only when they thought the conversation didn't matter. That's how I knew when it did. The activity room sat just off the main administrative corridor. A glass wall separated it from the hallway more for appearance than privacy. From my chair near the door, I could hear almost everything if people forgot to check who was inside. They usually did. It was during a weekday afternoon when staffing ran thin and supervisors floated between offices that I heard my son's voice again. He wasn't loud. He didn't need to be. "I don't want this dragging out," he said. "The paperwork should already be done." The facility manager responded in the same tone she used with everyone else, pleasant, efficient, accommodating. "We're moving as fast as we can," she said. "Some things still need final confirmation." From whom my son asked. "The assessment language," she replied. "It needs to align." There was a pause, the kind that happens when two people are deciding how much honesty is safe. "Well," my son said carefully, "you know what we're trying to accomplish here?" Another pause. "Yes," the manager said. "We do." That was when I reached into my pocket. They had taken my phone on intake. What they hadn't noticed was that I'd been given a replacement, one of those basic devices meant for emergencies. No apps. No distractions. Just calls. And recording. I pressed the button without looking down. My hands didn't shake. They never do when something finally makes sense. "I just need assurance," my son continued, "that there won't be complications later." The manager sighed softly. "As long as the guardianship stands, you're covered. Once assets are consolidated, things tend to settle. Settle. Another word people use when they mean locked in. And the timeline my son asked. "We can fast track the remaining documentation," she said, "but we'll need your sign-off today." "That's fine," he said immediately. Too quickly. "I'll come by." They both laughed then. A small relieved sound. I stared at the floor, forcing my breathing to stay even. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't interpretation. This was coordination. When the conversation ended, they walked past me without a glance. To them, I was just another resident waiting for dinner. The recording continued for another 30 seconds. Footsteps, doors opening, a printer whirring. Then silence. I stopped it and slipped the phone back into my pocket. That night, I listened to it again in my room. Headphones on volume low. Every word was clear. No raised voices, no threats, just intent. That was the mistake they made. People think crimes need drama. They don't. They need paperwork. I didn't tell anyone what I had. I didn't react differently the next day. I didn't withdraw. I didn't push. Instead, I asked the nurse how her daughter's college applications were going. I thanked the aide who brought my lunch. I complimented the manager on how organized the facility seemed. She smiled proudly. "We try to keep things efficient," she said. I can tell I replied. 2 days later, my son called. "Everything's almost finalized," he said. "You won't have to worry about anything soon." I let silence sit between us. "That must be a relief for you," I said finally. He laughed. "You have no idea." He was right. I had more than an idea. I had his voice. I had her confirmation. I had proof that this wasn't care. It was a coordinated transfer of control. But I still didn't move, because evidence isn't power until you place it in the right hands, and the wrong hands were still holding my life. For now. There's a difference between not being allowed to call a lawyer and being discouraged from trying. The first is illegal, the second is standard. No one ever told me I couldn't speak to an attorney. They just made sure every path toward one felt inconvenient, delayed, or unnecessary. "You don't need to worry about that right now," the social worker said when I asked. "Your son is handling everything," the nurse added kindly. "If there's a problem, your guardian will address it," administration repeated. Guardian. That word had become a wall. But walls only work if you accept where the doors are. The emergency phone was mounted low on the wall near the exit sign. Red plastic, one button, meant for falls, not plans. I'd noticed it my first week there. What I'd also noticed was the small printed label beneath it, "External calls permitted." They assumed no one would read that closely. The night shift was quieter, fewer supervisors, less paperwork, more routine. I waited until after midnight when the hallway lights dimmed and the nurses rotated rooms in predictable loops. When my turn passed, I stood up, walked to the phone, and pressed the button. A receptionist answered. Not the facility, an outside service. "Emergency line," she said. "This isn't a medical emergency," I replied calmly. "I need a phone number." There was a pause. Confusion. Then procedure. What kind of number? "A lawyer," I said. "One who handles guardianship disputes." She hesitated. "Sir, are you safe right now?" "I am," I said. "But I won't be for long if I don't make this call." She transferred me. The attorney who answered didn't interrupt me once. That's how I knew I'd found the right one. I told him everything. The court, the facility, the paperwork, the speed, the recording. When I mentioned the email chain, he stopped me. "Did you say fast-track documentation?" he asked. "Yes." "And you have that in writing?" "Yes." Another pause. This one heavier. "Do not tell anyone you contacted me," he said. "Not staff, not your son, not anyone." "I wasn't planning to," I replied. He exhaled. "Good. Because what you're describing isn't just guardianship, it's abuse of process." Those words landed differently than anything else had. Abuse of process. He explained it carefully. How temporary guardianship was meant to protect, not transfer wealth. How expedited assessments raised flags. How facilities were required to remain neutral, not collaborative. In the recording, I asked. "If it's clean," he said, "it's devastating." I didn't smile. I didn't relax. I asked the only question that mattered. "Can he stop me from fighting this?" "No," the lawyer said. "But he can make it harder." So we moved quietly. He told me what to do next. Not tomorrow, not eventually, immediately. I would request a copy of my medical assessment. I would document every restriction placed on me. I would say nothing about my objections, only that I was confused and needed clarification. Confusion created records. Records created timelines. Timelines created contradictions. And then I asked, Then we file an emergency motion, he said, and we freeze everything. I hung up and returned to my bed before anyone noticed I was gone. The next morning, my son arrived unexpectedly. He stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the room like he was checking inventory. "You okay?" he asked. "Of course," I said. "Why wouldn't I be?" He studied me for a moment. "Too long." "They're almost done," he said finally. "Just a few more steps." I nodded. "I trust you." The lie slid out easily. He smiled, relieved. And that's when I knew something important. He thought I was passive. He thought I was dependent. He thought the last signature would end this. He didn't know the paperwork had already turned against him. The system moves slowly. That's what people believe. What they don't understand is that it only moves slowly when no one forces it to look at itself. Once you introduce urgency, everything changes. I didn't announce anything. I didn't confront my son. I didn't warn the facility. I followed instructions. That morning, I asked politely for copies of my medical assessment. Not demanded, not challenged, requested. "I'm just a little confused," I said, tapping the edge of the nurse's station with one finger. "I want to understand what they're saying about me. Confusion is disarming." The nurse frowned slightly, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." 2 hours later, a thin packet appeared in my room. Thin. That was the first crack. If I were truly impaired, there would have been pages, observations, notes, patterns. Instead, there were checkboxes. Vague language, a single paragraph referencing family concerns. Family concerns, not clinical findings. That afternoon, I asked another harmless question. When was my last independent capacity evaluation? The administrator blinked. "Your guardian provided." "I'm sure," I said gently. "But when was the last one done without him present?" Silence. That night, I documented everything. Dates, times, who said what, when my phone was taken, when access was denied, when my son spoke for me without being asked. The lawyer had been right. Patterns emerged quickly when you forced them onto paper. On the third day, he filed the motion. Emergency petition to review guardianship authority. Motion to freeze financial transfers. Request for immediate hearing. The timing was precise. The facility received notice first. Not my son. That was deliberate. The mood changed immediately. Smiles tightened, voices lowered. Doors closed more often than before. The facility manager stopped calling me sweetheart and started calling me Mr. Harland. Administration asked me to wait while they clarified procedures. Clarify. Another word that means panic when spoken quietly. My son arrived that evening visibly agitated. "Why didn't you tell me you were unhappy here?" he asked, standing too close. "I thought you knew," I said. "I'm doing everything for you," he snapped. "I'm protecting you." I looked at him calmly. "Then you won't mind the review," I said. His face changed. Just for a second. That was all I needed. 2 days later, the court issued a temporary stay. Guardianship authority paused. Asset transfers, frozen facility cooperation under review. Paused. That word felt very different from temporary. The facility suddenly remembered my rights. I got my phone back. Unsupervised calls, private meetings. My son stopped visiting. Instead, his lawyer called. "We'd like to resolve this without escalation," he said. Escalation. Another word people use when they realize the ground has shifted. I told him nothing, because the game wasn't over yet. I had frozen the board, and now everyone could see who'd been moving the pieces. The hearing was scheduled for 48 hours later. That alone told me everything. Courts don't move that fast unless someone has made them nervous. I wasn't brought in through the public entrance this time. No wheelchair, no escort, just a quiet side hallway and a clerk who addressed me directly, not through my son, not through a guardian. "Mr. Harland," she said, "you'll be seated at counsel table." Counsel table. Not the gallery, not the back row, not observing, participating. My son arrived 10 minutes late. That wasn't like him. His confidence had always depended on being early prepared in control. Today his tie was slightly crooked. The facility manager entered with him. She avoided my eyes completely. When the judge took the bench, the tone in the room shifted immediately. This wasn't a routine confirmation hearing. This was a review. And reviews require explanations. The judge began without preamble. Temporary guardianship is an extraordinary measure, he said, looking directly at my son's attorney. It is not a convenience. It is not a financial instrument. My son swallowed. The attorney stood. He spoke about concern, safety, family stress, best intentions. The judge listened politely. Then he turned to the facility. I'd like you to explain, he said, why documentation appears to have been expedited before an independent capacity review was completed. The manager stiffened. She began with words like oversight and miscommunication. The judge didn't interrupt. He waited. And these emails, he asked, lifting a printed page, do they reflect your standard intake process? Silence. The sound of paper shifting suddenly felt loud. The judge turned the page. Align documentation accordingly, he read aloud. Align with what exactly? The manager glanced at my son. Just once. It was enough. My attorney stood then. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't dramatize, he laid out a timeline. Court filing, same-day facility intake, immediate account consolidation request, beneficiary changes initiated within days. This was not care, he said simply. This was execution. That word echoed. My son's attorney objected. The judge waved him off. Then he looked at me. Mr. Harland, he said, were you ever informed you could contest this arrangement independently? No, I replied. Were you given access to counsel? No. Were you informed that your assets were being transferred? No, The judge nodded slowly. Then he asked the question my son had never expected. Why the urgency? My son opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. We just wanted things settled, he said. Before anything happened, before what the judge asked. Another pause. My attorney pressed a button on his tablet. The audio filled the room, clear, calm, undeniable. Fast-track the remaining documentation. Once assets are consolidated, things tend to settle. My son's face went pale. The facility manager stared at the table. The judge let the recording play all the way through. When it ended, the room felt smaller. This court, the judge said, does not exist to assist in asset acquisition. He looked at my son. Temporary guardianship is hereby terminated. My son exhaled sharply like he'd been punched. All financial actions taken under this authority are void pending investigation. The facility's attorney began to speak. The judge raised a hand. And this court is referring this matter to the appropriate oversight bodies. Oversight. That word finally belonged to them. I didn't look at my son when the ruling ended. I didn't need to. I had watched him lose control of the narrative, and in a system built on paper and procedure that was everything. Before any court papers carried my name, before anyone questioned my capacity to decide for myself, I was just a man who believed he had done what he was supposed to do. I was 68 years old when all of this began, old enough that people spoke to me more slowly, young enough that I still fixed my own sink and drove myself to the grocery store every Sunday morning. I had worked for 43 years without interruption. No gaps, no dramatic career changes, just consistency. I spent most of my life as a mechanical supervisor at a regional manufacturing plant. Not an executive, not a name on a door. I was the man who showed up before sunrise, made sure machines ran safely, and stayed late when something broke because someone else needed to get home to their family. I believed in earning things the long way. My hands carried the proof. Scarred knuckles. A wrist that never fully healed after a press malfunction in my 40s. I never complained about those injuries. They were part of the bargain. You give your body to work, and in return, work gives you stability. That was the deal I accepted. I married young, too young, some people said. My wife and I didn't have much when we started, a small rental, secondhand furniture. But we shared an understanding that mattered more than money. If we built something solid, it would take care of our children long after we were gone. We raised our son to believe that effort mattered, that promises mattered, that family was something you protected, not something you exploited when it became inconvenient. At least that's what I thought we were teaching him. I was never a loud father. I didn't yell. I didn't lecture. I believed example was stronger than instruction. When my son watched me leave the house every morning, even when I was sick, that was the lesson. When he saw me refuse overtime pay I hadn't earned, that was the lesson. By the time he left for college, I believed I had done my part. When my wife passed away, something in the house went quiet in a way I didn't know how to describe. It wasn't loneliness exactly. It was the absence of being witnessed, the absence of someone who knew the rhythm of my life without explanation. I kept going anyway. I cooked my own meals, paid my own bills, maintained my routines. I didn't spiral, I didn't withdraw. I simply adjusted. That adjustment would later be described as isolation. I never saw it that way. I saw it as dignity. I valued independence more than comfort. I valued clarity more than reassurance. I didn't need constant company to know who I was, and I certainly didn't need supervision. What I needed, what I thought I had earned, was the right to finish my life on my own terms. That belief shaped every decision I made. It shaped how I worked, how I saved, how I planned. And it shaped how blindsided I was when people who claimed to love me began speaking about my life as if it were already past tense. At the time, I didn't recognize the warning signs. I didn't hear danger in casual concern. I didn't see strategy in polite questions. I was still living under one assumption, that the man I had been for decades would be seen clearly by the people closest to me. I didn't know yet that my history, my patience, my silence, my restraint was already being rewritten as weakness. And I had no idea that everything I had built would soon be used as justification for taking my voice away. I didn't inherit anything. That's an important detail, even if no one thought it mattered later. Everything I owned came from years of saying no to small comforts, so I could say yes to long-term security. I wasn't chasing wealth. I was building insulation against emergencies, against dependency, against becoming a burden to anyone. The house was the first thing. A modest 3-bedroom on a quiet street, bought when interest rates were high and my salary was still climbing. I painted the walls myself, replaced the roof in stages, fixed what broke instead of upgrading what didn't need attention. That house held decades of ordinary life. Birthdays, arguments that ended quietly, evenings that didn't need explanations. When my wife was alive, she used to say the place felt steady, like it knew who it belonged to. After she died, people started calling it too much house for one person. I never agreed. A home doesn't shrink just because someone is gone. It keeps its purpose. It keeps its memory. And it keeps its value, emotional and otherwise. By the time I retired, the mortgage was paid off. Clean, no liens, no complications. I had planned it that way. My savings followed the same philosophy. A primary checking account for expenses. A separate account I rarely touched. Long-term investments spread out conservatively. No speculation. No risk I didn't understand. I trusted boring. I also trusted structure. Years earlier, after watching a friend's family tear itself apart over medical decisions, I set up a trust. Not because I expected trouble, but because I believed preparation was an act of love. The trust was simple, transparent, designed to avoid confusion, not create it. I remained in full control. I named beneficiaries, defined conditions, left no room for interpretation. Everything was reviewed, notarized, and filed properly. At the time, my son thanked me. "It's smart," he said. "Most people don't plan this far ahead." I took that as reassurance. I didn't know it was also reconnaissance. I kept detailed records. Deeds in a fireproof box. Account statements organized by year. Contact information for my accountant and attorney, written down, not just saved digitally. Redundancy matters when you've lived long enough to see systems fail. I never hid any of this from my family. I believe secrecy bred suspicion, openness bred trust. So when my son asked questions about the house, about beneficiaries, about what would happen if something ever happened to me, I answered calmly. Why wouldn't I? I was proud of what I'd built. Not because it was impressive, but because it was stable. It meant I wouldn't have to ask anyone for help. That was always the goal. What I didn't understand then was how preparation can look like opportunity to the wrong people. How clarity can be mistaken for availability. How a well-documented life becomes easy to dismantle if someone decides you're no longer entitled to manage it. Every account had a name. Every document had a signature. Every safeguard assumed good faith. And good faith, I would learn, is not a legal requirement. At the time, I still believed something else. That the people who stood to benefit from my planning would respect the fact that it was meant to protect me first. I didn't yet know that what I had built carefully, patiently, legally was already being studied, measured, timed. There is a moment in every family when respect quietly changes shape. No argument announces it. No confrontation marks the date. It just happens slowly enough that you don't notice until the tone of conversation shifts and you realize you're no longer being asked. You're being informed. With my son, it began after my wife died. At first, the concern felt genuine. He called more often, asked if I was eating properly, suggested I let him handle certain errands to take things off my plate. I didn't resist. I had nothing to prove. But concern, when repeated often enough, turns into supervision. He started correcting me in front of other people. Small things. Harmless things. You already told that story, Dad. That's not how it works anymore. Let me explain it in a simpler way. Always said with a smile. Always framed as help. I noticed the pattern before I named it. When decisions came up, holidays, repairs, finances, my input was acknowledged, then quietly overridden. Not aggressively, politely. That's one option, my son would say. Let's think about what makes the most sense. What made the most sense was always what he wanted. My daughter-in-law joined in without hesitation. She spoke to me the way people speak to someone they've already decided is fragile. Slowly, loudly, with reassurance layered over impatience. She asked if I was comfortable driving at night, if I still remembered passwords, if I thought it was wise to manage investments alone. Each question carried an assumption. I answered calmly, clearly, fully. It didn't change anything. What I didn't realize at the time was that my silence, my refusal to argue, was being interpreted as surrender. I had always believed that restraint earned respect, that not reacting emotionally gave your words more weight when you finally spoke. In my family, it had the opposite effect. They began speaking about me as if I weren't in the room. He doesn't like change, my son would say to others. He gets overwhelmed, my daughter-in-law added. He means well, but he's from a different time. From a different time. That phrase followed me everywhere. It made dismissal sound reasonable. It made exclusion sound responsible. I watched how decisions were made now. Quiet conversations in the kitchen. Text messages exchanged while I sat nearby. Plans finalized before I was told they existed. When I did speak, I noticed something else. They didn't argue with me anymore. They reassured me. And reassurance is what you give someone you don't intend to listen to. I wasn't angry, not then. I was observant. I noticed how often my son framed things in terms of burden. It's just easier if I handle it. You shouldn't have to worry about this. Let us take care of you. Care is a word that sounds generous until it's used to justify control. I also noticed what they stopped asking me. They stopped asking what I wanted. They stopped asking what I planned. They stopped asking how I felt about the future. They assumed it. An assumption is the most dangerous form of certainty. I didn't confront them. I didn't push back publicly. I didn't accuse. I stored the information away. Because I had lived long enough to understand one thing. People reveal their intentions not in what they say once, but in what they repeat when they think you're no longer a factor. By the time they began discussing my life as something that needed managing, they had already decided I was no longer the authority over it. I just didn't know yet how far they were willing to go to make that belief official. The first time it happened, no one raised their voice. That's why it took me a moment to recognize it for what it was. It was a Sunday dinner at my son's house. Nothing formal, just the three of us around a table that was too large for the conversation it held. My daughter-in-law had cooked. My son had poured the wine. Everything looked exactly the way a normal family evening should look, which is how these things usually begin. We were halfway through the meal when my son brought it up casually, as if it had just occurred to him. Dad, he said we were thinking maybe it's time you stopped driving at night. He didn't ask, he stated it. I set my fork down slowly. Why? He shrugged. It's just safer. Your reaction time isn't what it used to be. I've never had an accident, I said. That doesn't mean you won't, my daughter-in-law added quickly. We just worry again. I looked from one to the other. If I felt unsafe, I wouldn't drive. My son smiled. That's exactly the problem. People don't always notice when it's time to adjust. Adjust. There it was, the first suggestion that my judgment couldn't be trusted. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply said, I'll think about it. That should have been the end of it. Instead, my daughter-in-law stood up and walked to the counter. She returned with a small envelope and placed it beside my plate. We already talked to the insurance company, she said. They offer discounts if family members help manage transportation. I stared at the envelope. You talked to them about me. My son nodded, just gathering information, without me, without asking, without considering that maybe the person whose life was being discussed should be part of the conversation. I felt something tighten in my chest then. Not anger, recognition. This wasn't concern. This was rehearsal. I pushed the envelope back toward them. I don't need help managing my transportation. My son's smile faltered just slightly. You don't have to get defensive, he said. We're just trying to help. There it was again. Help used like a shield. The rest of the dinner passed quietly. Too quietly. They changed the subject, asked me about work stories I'd already told, laughed at the right moments, but something fundamental had shifted. On my way out, my son took my keys from the bowl by the door. I'll hold on to these tonight, he said, just in case. Just in case. I didn't react. I didn't reach for them. I didn't make a scene. I held his gaze and said, bring them back tomorrow. He hesitated, then nodded. He did return them, but he never apologized. And that was how I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a test. They wanted to see if I would resist. They wanted to see how far they could step into my life before I pushed back. I drove home that night thinking about how easily my keys had changed hands, how naturally they'd assumed the right to take them. And I understood something important. Once someone decides you are no longer the authority over yourself, every boundary becomes negotiable. That dinner wasn't about driving. It was about permission. And without realizing it, they had just asked for more than they were entitled to. What began as suggestions slowly hardened into expectations. After the dinner, the calls increased. Not urgent, not confrontational, just frequent enough to feel supervisory. My son asked where I was going before I left the house, asked who I had spoken to that day, asked if I was keeping track of things. I answered him honestly. That honesty became ammunition. He offered to help with my bills. Not because I missed payments I never had, but because, as he put it, it's easy to forget things when you're under stress. He suggested setting reminders, then suggested shared access, then suggested taking over entirely for now. For now became a familiar phrase. I declined calmly, each time. My daughter-in-law took a different approach. She framed everything as convenience. She showed up with printed forms she claimed would simplify my life. Automatic payments, account consolidations, digital access I supposedly wouldn't need to worry about. Just sign here, she said, once tapping a highlighted line. It's nothing permanent. I read it carefully. It wasn't nothing. I slid it back across the table. I don't need this. Her smile froze, then reset. You don't trust us. Trust. Another word turned sharp. They began showing up unannounced, dropping by during business hours, commenting on the state of the house, asking if I'd considered selling and moving somewhere safer. When I said no, they didn't argue. They documented. I noticed my son typing notes on his phone after our conversations. I noticed the way he repeated my words back to me later, slightly altered. You said you get tired easily. You mentioned you forget appointments. You admitted it's getting harder to manage everything. I had said none of those things. But repetition has a way of rewriting memory, especially when it's not your own being recorded. One afternoon, I returned home to find a locksmith's card on my counter. I asked my son about it. Oh, he said lightly. We were just talking about security. It's not safe to live alone at your age. At your age. I told him to stop. That was the first time I used that word. He looked surprised, not offended, curious. Like a man testing a door he assumed would open. The pressure increased after that. They suggested I stop handling investments until things settle, suggested I move closer to them, suggested I let them speak to my doctor just to coordinate care. When I refused, their tone changed. You're being difficult. You're making this harder than it needs to be. We're only trying to protect you. Protection had become justification. I noticed how often they spoke to others about me. Neighbors, relatives, professionals, always framed as concern. always phrased carefully. He's been under a lot of stress. He's not as sharp as he used to be. We're starting to worry. Worry travels faster than truth. I realized then that this wasn't a series of misunderstandings. It was a campaign, slow, methodical, designed to make resistance look unreasonable. They weren't waiting for me to fail. They were preparing for it. And the more I held my ground, the more urgent they became. Urgency is the clearest sign of intent, because people who are truly helping can afford patience. People who are racing a plan cannot. By itself, each incident could have been explained away. Concern, stress, overprotectiveness. That's how people justify things when they don't want to see what's forming in front of them. But patterns don't announce themselves all at once. They repeat quietly until denial becomes harder than recognition. I began replaying conversations in my head, not emotionally, but structurally. Who spoke first? Who redirected the topic? Who summarized what had supposedly been said? The pattern was always the same. They framed the situation. I responded. They rephrased my response later, never accurately, always more alarming. When I said I was tired after a long day, it became, he's exhausted all the time. When I said technology annoyed me, it became, he can't keep up anymore. When I said I preferred paper statements, it became, he's resistant to modern systems. Every neutral preference was being translated into a deficiency, and those translations weren't staying inside the family. I noticed it when my doctor asked questions he'd never asked before. Are you managing your medications okay? Do you feel confused often? Has your family expressed any concerns about your memory? Family concerns. The same phrase repeated in different rooms by different people. I answered clearly, precisely. I corrected assumptions. I asked where the information was coming from. The doctor nodded, but he also typed. That's when I understood something critical. I wasn't just being talked about. I was being documented. Small notes, minor flags, vague impressions, none of them damning on their own, but together they formed a shadow version of me that didn't match reality. And once a version of you exists on paper, it doesn't need your permission to grow. The same thing happened with my accountant. He called to check in, asked if I wanted my son copied on correspondence going forward, mentioned it might be easier for everyone. I declined. A week later, my son referenced a conversation I'd never had with the accountant. He said, "You seemed overwhelmed, my son told me." He hadn't, but my refusal had been translated again. Overwhelmed is what people write when they need justification. I began to see the structure clearly. Step 1, create concern. Step 2, repeat it to authority figures. Step 3, document reactions selectively. Step 4, wait until the narrative stands on its own. No confrontation required, no argument needed, just repetition. I tested the theory once during a routine visit. I deliberately paused before answering a question. Not long, just long enough to notice. The nurse wrote something down. "What did you note?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just that you seemed unsure." I wasn't unsure. I was careful. That was the moment I stopped giving them the benefit of the doubt. This wasn't fear-driven behavior. It was coordinated. My son and his wife weren't reacting to my decline. They were building a record that suggested one. And once that record existed, they wouldn't need my cooperation anymore. They would only need the right moment. Patterns once seen can't be unseen, and this one pointed in a single direction. Toward control. Toward authority. Toward a future where my voice would be considered optional. I didn't confront them. I didn't warn them. I did something far more important. I stopped assuming innocence, because from that point on, every interaction had a different purpose. Not to resolve anything, but to observe how far they were willing to go. The first sign arrived disguised as mail. A thick envelope sat on my kitchen counter one afternoon when I came back from the store. I hadn't seen it there when I left. My name was typed on the front, but the return address belonged to a law office I didn't recognize. I opened it slowly. Inside were copies. Not originals. Documents I already knew by heart, but altered just enough to feel wrong. A summary of my assets, a list of accounts, an outdated version of my trust attached with a note that said, "For review." No explanation. No signature request. Just presence. I called my son. Oh, that, he said lightly. We were just getting things organized. You don't need to worry. Organized for whom? I asked him why a law office was involved. He didn't answer directly. It's just preliminary. Nothing's happening yet. Yet. That word lodged itself in my chest. A week later, I received a text from my daughter-in-law while I was at the bank. Did you mean to withdraw that much cash? I stared at the screen. I hadn't told her where I was. I hadn't told her what I was doing. I typed back slowly. Yes. Her reply came immediately. Just checking. We want to make sure everything's okay. Everything. I looked around the bank lobby, then at the people standing in line, filling out forms, living their lives without supervision, and I understood something new. I was being watched, not overtly, not aggressively, administratively. The next sign came from my doctor's office. A voicemail, polite and neutral, asking me to come in to discuss some recent concerns. When I returned the call and asked what those concerns were, the receptionist hesitated. Your family requested a cognitive screening, she said. Requested, without me. I declined the appointment. 2 days later, my son showed up at my door unannounced. He stood on the porch like a man delivering bad news he believed was inevitable. Why won't you just cooperate? He asked. With what? I replied. With making things easier, he said. For everyone. There was frustration in his voice now. Not fear, not worry, impatience. I told him I hadn't authorized any screenings, any legal reviews, any financial oversight. He sighed. Dad, this is exactly what we're talking about. What I asked. Your resistance, he said. It's not healthy. Resistance. Another word added to the file. After he left, I went through my house carefully. Drawers, files, cabinets, nothing was missing. But something else was. My fireproof box, the one where I kept originals, had been moved. Not opened. Moved, just enough to let me know someone knew where it was. That night I didn't sleep, not because I was afraid. Because fear had finally been replaced by certainty. These weren't misunderstandings anymore. They weren't even escalations. They were preparations. Legal, medical, financial. All moving in parallel. All without my consent. And all pointing toward a single conclusion. They weren't waiting for permission. They were waiting for a moment, and whatever they planned to do next wouldn't involve asking me anything at all. The moment came on a Tuesday morning. Not during an argument, not after a crisis, not in the middle of anything dramatic. That's how I knew it was intentional. I had just finished breakfast when there was a knock at the door. 2 sharp taps, practiced and confident. Not the way family knocks. The way professionals do. When I opened it, my son stood on the porch with a woman I didn't recognize. She held a clipboard. He didn't. Dad, he said, already stepping inside. We need to talk. The woman followed without waiting for an invitation. This is Karen, my son continued. She's a care coordinator. I didn't ask for one, I said. Karen smiled. The same trained smile I'd seen before. Calm, reassuring, empty. We're just here to assess, she said. Nothing permanent. Nothing permanent. They always said that. I asked them to leave. My son ignored me and gestured toward the living room. Karen began looking around, noting things. The stairs, the kitchen, the bathroom door frame. You don't have permission to be here, I said. My son's voice hardened. You're not thinking clearly. That was the first time he said it out loud. Not hinted, not implied, stated. I told him to get out. Instead, he pulled a folded document from his jacket and placed it on the table. Doctor signed off this morning, he said. Temporary incapacity, just to make sure you're safe. I picked it up. It wasn't a diagnosis, it was a referral. Language carefully chosen, ambiguous, conditional, enough to move things forward. You lied, I said. He didn't deny it. Dad, stop, he said. You're making this worse. Karen stepped closer. Sir, we need you to come with us. Where? I asked. She glanced at my son before answering. An evaluation facility. Facility. I laughed once. Short, without humor. You don't have that authority, I said. My son met my eyes. For the first time, there was no softness left. Yes, he said. I do. I reached for my phone. Karen moved first. She placed her hand over it, gentle but firm. like someone calming a child. You don't need that right now, she said. That was it. The line. Not the paperwork, not the lies, not the preparation. The moment my phone was taken from my hand, I stood very still. I'm calling the police, I said. My son shook his head. That won't help. Why not? Because they're already aware, he replied. The front door opened behind me. 2 officers stepped inside. They didn't rush. They didn't draw weapons. They looked at me the way people look at problems they've been briefed on. One of them spoke gently. Sir, your family has expressed concern about your well-being. Family concern. Again. I asked to see a warrant. They didn't have one. They didn't need one. They had paperwork. I tried to explain, calmly, clearly, precisely. The officers listened politely. Then one of them nodded toward Karen. Let's keep this cooperative, he said. Cooperative. Another word for surrender. I wasn't handcuffed. That detail matters. I was escorted. Out of my house. Through my front door, in full view of my neighbors. My son locked the door behind us. I watched him turn the key. That sound, the click of a lock I no longer controlled, cut deeper than anything else. As they guided me toward the car, I understood something with perfect clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding that got out of hand. This wasn't concern gone too far. This was the plan, executed. And everything I had noticed, the paperwork, the questions, the documentation had been rehearsal. They hadn't crossed the line in anger. They had crossed it calmly, legally, deliberately. And once I was inside that car, I knew there would be no undoing this through conversation, only through proof. Silence came first, not the peaceful kind, not the reflective kind, the procedural kind. No one explained anything on the drive. The officer in the passenger seat filled out forms on a tablet. Karen made a call, her voice low and professional, describing me as if I weren't sitting 3 feet away. Cooperative. Alert. Some agitation earlier. Agitation. I stared out the window and watched my street disappear behind us. Houses I recognized. People I nodded to. A life that still existed, just not for me. When we arrived, there was no sign. No welcome desk, just a side entrance and a security door that opened with a code Karen already knew. Inside, the air smelled sterile and faintly sweet. A place designed to calm people who didn't realize they were being processed. They took my phone, my wallet, my keys, each item placed in a plastic bag with my name written in black marker. I asked who I could call. Your son will handle communication, the intake nurse said. I asked when I could leave. We'll see how the evaluation goes, she replied. I asked to speak to a lawyer. She paused. Just long enough to make a note. No need to worry about that right now, she said. Let's get you settled. Settled. I was shown to a small room with a bed bolted to the floor and a window that didn't open. The door closed behind me with a soft click that felt louder than it should have. That was the moment I stopped talking. Not because I was afraid, because I understood the rules had changed. Anything I said could be written down. Anything I questioned could be framed as confusion. Anything I resisted could be labeled agitation. So I said nothing. Hours passed. Or maybe it was minutes. Time behaves differently when no one marks it for you. A nurse came in and asked questions. I answered briefly, clearly, with no elaboration. Another staff member observed from the corner, pretending not to. They wanted reactions. They didn't get them. That night alone in that room, I replayed the morning in my head. Not emotionally, logistically. The timing, the referral, the officers already informed. This hadn't been an emergency response. It had been scheduled. I lay on the bed staring at the ceiling and felt something solidify inside me. Not anger. Resolve. I wouldn't plead. I wouldn't explain. I wouldn't try to convince anyone of anything. Because I finally understood the only thing that mattered. This was no longer about family. It was about records. And records could be challenged. But only if I stayed quiet long enough to understand exactly how they were being written. After that first night, I learned how to become smaller. Not weaker, not confused, smaller. I stopped asking questions, not because I didn't have them, but because every question invited an entry in a file. Every clarification became a concern. Every objection turned into non-compliance. So I withdrew. When staff spoke to me, I answered briefly, politely, without color. Yes. No. I understand. I no longer corrected inaccuracies. I no longer explained myself. I let assumptions sit where they landed. That was not surrender. That was containment. My son visited once during that period. He stood on the other side of the room, hands folded, posture careful, like someone observing a controlled environment he believed was finally stable. "You doing okay?" he asked. "I'm fine," I said. He studied my face, searching for something: anger, confusion, resistance. There was none. "Good," he said, relieved. "This will go smoother if you don't fight it." Fight? He still thought this was about emotion. After that contact diminished, calls were shorter, visits less frequent. Oversight replaced presence. I noticed the shift immediately. When people think you've accepted your position, they stop performing. Staff discussed schedules in front of me, mentioned paperwork deadlines casually, spoke about clearance and approvals like I wasn't the subject of those conversations. One nurse apologized once for a delay. "They're still finalizing your documentation," she said. "Finalizing, not evaluating, not reviewing, finalizing." I stored the word away. Days passed without markers, no calendar, no access to news, just meals, medication, observation. In that quiet, something important happened. I began to see the outline of the system clearly. Who answered to whom? Which staff deferred before speaking? When decisions were made without discussion. I noticed how often my son's name appeared in conversations he wasn't present for. Your guardian approved. Your guardian requested, your guardian prefers guardian. That word had replaced my name, and with it my authority. I didn't correct them. I let them assume I was compliant, because compliance is invisible, and invisible people are rarely guarded closely. At night, when the hallway lights dimmed and the facility settled into its mechanical rhythm, I replayed conversations not emotionally but strategically. What had been decided? What still needed approval? What moved quickly and what stalled? Speed, I realized, was the tell. Anything involving my finances moved faster than anything involving my well-being. That imbalance wasn't accidental, it was directional. I was no longer trying to escape. I was mapping. Because once you understand how something works, you don't need to panic about it. You just need time. And for the first time since my front door had been locked behind me, time was something they believed they controlled. They didn't realize I was using it too. The first real clue didn't arrive with drama. It arrived quietly disguised as routine. A nurse I hadn't seen before came in one morning with a clipboard and a distracted look. She apologized for being late, then flipped through pages as if searching for something that should have been obvious. "I just need to confirm," she said. "You're scheduled for transfer next week, correct?" I looked at her. "Transfer where?" She froze. Her eyes dropped back to the clipboard. "I might have the wrong chart." She left too quickly. That was the moment, not because of what she said, but because of what she assumed I already knew. Transfers require planning. Planning requires approval. Approval leaves a trail. Later that day, during medication distribution, I noticed a thin yellow folder tucked beneath the main chart at the nurse's station. My name was written on the tab, but the color was different from the others. I asked casually, "What's the yellow one for?" The nurse didn't look up. Administrative. Administrative meant financial or legal, never medical. That night, I replayed the word transfer again and again. Not discharge, not review, transfer. Facilities don't transfer people without reason, and they don't do it quickly unless there's pressure. 2 days later, pressure revealed itself. The facility manager made an unscheduled visit to my room. No clipboard, no smile. "We're just checking in," she said, "making sure everything is comfortable." Comfort wasn't her concern. Timing was. I asked her a question I already knew the answer to. "Am I staying here long term?" She hesitated. "Just long enough." "That depends," she said, "on how things progress." Progress. Another non-answer. After she left, I did something I hadn't done since arriving. I paid attention to the mail cart. Most residents received personal letters, bills, cards, notices. I received nothing, which didn't make sense. My accounts were active. My address hadn't officially changed. Someone had intervened. That evening, during a brief supervised phone call with my son, I mentioned it. "I haven't been getting mail," I said. He didn't miss a beat. I redirected it. Things were getting complicated. Complicated for whom? What kind of things, I asked. "Statements, notices, stuff you don't need to worry about," he replied. "I'll handle it." There it was. Not concern, not care. Control. After the call, I sat alone and understood the first concrete truth of my situation. They weren't waiting to see how I did. They were already moving me, physically, administratively, financially, and they were doing it before any independent review could interfere. That was the clue. Not the paperwork. Not the confinement. The speed. People who believe they're right move carefully. People who fear interruption move fast. And my son was moving very fast. Once you see the first thread, the rest become easier to follow. I stopped thinking in terms of events and started thinking in terms of movement. What advanced quickly? What stalled? What required signatures? What didn't? Medical reviews moved slowly. Personal requests stalled indefinitely. Anything tied to money moved with urgency. The transfer mentioned by the nurse wasn't about care. It wasn't about capacity. It was about jurisdiction. Different facilities meant different paperwork. Different paperwork meant different access. And different access meant fewer eyes that knew me. I began listening more carefully to how staff spoke when they thought the conversation didn't involve me. "He wants this finalized before month's end. Guardian approval already on file. Accounting is waiting on confirmation." Accounting. That word didn't belong anywhere near my room. One afternoon, while sitting in the common area, I noticed the facility manager step aside to take a call. She lowered her voice, but not enough. "Yes," she said, "we can accommodate that timeline." A pause. "No, it shouldn't be an issue." Another pause. "We'll fast-track the rest." Fast-track. The same word appeared again. Later, a staff member brought in paperwork for another resident and left it briefly on the table beside me. It wasn't mine, but it showed me the format. Intake, assessment, authorization. 3 steps. Mine had skipped one. There had been no independent assessment without family present. No neutral evaluation, just referrals, summaries, and assumptions layered on top of each other. I began replaying my son's earlier questions differently. Why he'd asked about the trust structure. Why he'd pushed for consolidation. Why he'd wanted shared access temporarily. It wasn't preparation for my decline, it was preparation for transfer. Once assets changed hands, even administratively, it would be harder to reverse, even if guardianship was challenged later. That was the race. I also noticed something else. Every professional involved had been introduced to the same version of me. Stressed, resistant, overwhelmed. That version justified urgency. It justified intervention. It justified acting on my behalf without waiting for my consent. I tested the connections quietly. I asked a nurse what paperwork would be required for a transfer. She listed it offhandedly. Guardian approval, facility coordination, financial confirmation. Financial confirmation. The loop closed. I wasn't being moved because I was declining. I was being moved because I was inconvenient. Each step made the next easier. Each document referenced the last. Each signature relied on assumptions already recorded. It was a chain, and chains only work if no one questions the first link. I sat there surrounded by people watching television and felt something settle into place. This wasn't chaos. It was structure. And once you understand the structure, you don't need emotion. You need proof. Because structures collapse when the connections are exposed. Confirmation doesn't arrive as a single revelation. It arrives when every remaining doubt runs out of places to hide. I got mine on a Thursday afternoon during a routine check that wasn't supposed to matter. A staff member I'd spoken with only once before came into my room carrying a tablet. She apologized for the interruption and explained she needed to verify Guardian-authorized updates. Her tone suggested this was ordinary. I asked what kind of updates. She glanced at the screen. Financial coordination, resident status, ongoing authority. Ongoing. That word didn't belong to anything temporary. I asked her to scroll back. She hesitated, then did. There it was. A timeline I wasn't meant to see. Guardianship filing date, facility intake, account access approvals, mail redirection, pending residence transfer, all listed as sequential steps, not reactions. Steps. What happens if the guardianship is challenged? I asked. She looked up startled. It isn't. That answer was too quick. Hypothetically, I said. She shifted her weight. Then these actions would be reviewed. Reviewed, not reversed, not halted. Reviewed. That told me everything. The system assumed permanence. The word temporary was cosmetic. Later that evening, the facility manager requested a brief meeting. She closed the door behind her and sat across from me with the posture of someone delivering reassurance. Your son is very proactive, she said. He wants to make sure things don't fall through the cracks. Which things? I asked. She smiled thinly. The important ones. She slid a single page across the table. Authorization confirmation. My name typed. My son's signature below it. Effective immediately. No end date, no conditions, no independent review noted. That was the moment certainty replaced suspicion. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about care. This was about control executed through momentum. They had built a chain of authority designed to survive scrutiny simply by existing long enough to look normal. I handed the page back. You should know, I said evenly, that none of this was explained to me. She paused. Your guardian. I'm not incapacitated, I said. And I never consented. Her expression tightened. We're just following procedure, she replied. Procedure. The refuge of everyone who benefits from not thinking. That night, I lay awake and reviewed everything I now knew. The speed, the coordination, the lack of neutral evaluation, the absence of my voice at every critical step. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a bypass. A system designed to move around me instead of through me. And once I saw it clearly, something else became clear too. There was no point confronting anyone inside that structure. They weren't the decision makers. They were the mechanism. If I wanted this to stop, I would have to step outside the process entirely, not with emotion, with law, with evidence, with patience, because the truth had finally settled into one undeniable fact. Everything that had happened was documented. And documentation cuts both ways. I didn't make the decision in a moment of anger. There was no breaking point, no surge of emotion that pushed me into action. The decision came quietly, the way most irreversible choices do after the noise has died down and only facts remain. I stopped thinking about my son, not because he didn't matter, but because focusing on him led nowhere useful. Betrayal invites emotion. Emotion clouds judgment, and judgment was the only thing I couldn't afford to lose. I focused instead on process. Every step taken so far had followed a pattern, not a lawful one, an efficient one. Shortcuts. Assumptions. Paperwork moving faster than people. Authority granted without scrutiny because it arrived wrapped in concern. That meant something important. They hadn't prepared for resistance. They had prepared for compliance. Everything in place assumed I would remain quiet, confused, or grateful. No one had planned for me to challenge the structure itself. That was the opening. I made a list in my head and refined it over several days. What I would not do, I would not confront my son again. I would not argue with staff. I would not demand explanations. I would not try to prove I was fine. All of those actions fed the narrative they'd already written. What I would do was slower, colder, more effective. I would let them keep documenting every approval, every assumption, every expedited step. I would let the record grow exactly as they intended, because a clean lie is harder to undo than a messy one. And they were getting sloppy. I would say less, not more. I would ask neutral questions framed as confusion, not resistance. Questions that forced answers to be written down. I would request copies instead of explanations. And most importantly, I would prepare to bring in someone who didn't belong to their system. A lawyer. Not yet. Not openly. Not until the picture was complete. Because once you introduce law, the pace changes. Everything freezes. People stop improvising. Words are chosen carefully. I needed to know exactly where to apply pressure before I touched anything. That was the decision. Not to fight them where they were strongest, but to wait until they finished what they were doing and then show it to someone who understood exactly why it was illegal. I lay back on the bed that night and closed my eyes, not to rest, but to focus. They believed they had already won. They believed time favored them. They believed I was alone. They were wrong on all three counts. I didn't need to rush. I just needed to be precise. Finding the right lawyer wasn't about speed. It was about distance. I didn't want someone recommended by the facility. I didn't want someone my son had ever spoken to. I didn't want someone who treated guardianship like paperwork instead of power. I needed someone who understood why this mattered. The opportunity came quietly. During a routine administrative check, a staff member left a directory on the table in the common room. Local services, community resources, legal aid numbers printed in small, forgettable type. Most people ignored it. I memorized one name, not because it was familiar, but because it wasn't. The call itself took less than 5 minutes. I didn't explain everything. I didn't vent. I didn't dramatize. I said 3 things. I'm under temporary guardianship. It was granted without an independent capacity evaluation. My assets were accessed immediately. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice changed. Do you have documentation? The attorney asked. Yes. And are you still under the guardian's control? Yes. Another pause. Then you need to stop talking to everyone except me, he said. And you need to do it now. That was how I knew he understood. We spoke privately 2 nights later after hours when the facility was quiet and supervision relaxed into routine. He didn't promise outcomes. He didn't express outrage. He explained structure. Guardianship, he told me, was supposed to protect incapacitated people, not accelerate asset control. Any deviation from that sequence raised red flags. Medical determination first. Independent review. Limited authority. Ongoing oversight. My case had reversed that order. Authority first, assets second, review later, if ever. That's not care, he said. That's exploitation. He asked for timelines, copies, names. I had them. He asked how quickly things had moved. I told him. He exhaled slowly. They rushed, he said. That's good for you. We built the structure carefully. Not a confrontation, not an accusation, a challenge. Emergency motion to review guardianship authority, request for stay on financial actions, demand for independent evaluation. Each step designed to freeze momentum. Because momentum was all they had. If they'd waited, the lawyer said this would be harder. They hadn't waited. They had assumed silence meant consent. The lawyer told me something else before the call ended. You don't need to prove you're perfect, he said. You just need to prove they were reckless. That was the first time since this began that I allowed myself to feel something close to certainty. Not relief. Alignment. For the first time, the process belonged to someone who wasn't invested in my silence. The structure was in place, and once structure meets exposure, speed becomes a liability. The trap wasn't something we built from scratch. It was already there. They had created it themselves by moving too fast, by assuming no one would ever look closely, by treating paperwork like camouflage instead of evidence. All we had to do was stop interfering. The lawyer was very clear about that. Don't disrupt the process, he told me. Let it finish forming. That went against instinct. Every part of me wanted to interrupt, to demand explanations, to stop signatures, to shout that none of this was legal. But instinct is what gets people labeled uncooperative. So I did the opposite. I complied. When staff asked questions, I answered calmly. When documents appeared, I acknowledged receipt. When my son called, I kept my voice neutral and short. He interpreted my silence as surrender. That made him careless. He started talking more freely, mentioning timelines, referring to things being almost done, using language that assumed permanence. During one call, he said something small but fatal. Once the transfer is complete, none of this will matter anymore. Transfer, not care, not evaluation. Transfer. I repeated the word back to him gently. What transfer? He laughed. You don't need to worry about that. But it was already recorded. The lawyer had instructed me to document everything, but never in a way that looked like documentation. Dates written down privately, names stored mentally, statements remembered verbatim, nothing reactive, nothing dramatic. Meanwhile, he was filing quietly. The emergency motion wasn't submitted right away. It was prepared, reviewed, timed. We waited for 2 things to align: First, a completed financial action under guardianship authority. Second, clear evidence that medical justification lagged behind asset movement. That combination mattered. One proved intent, the other proved abuse. When the notice finally arrived, confirmation that my primary account access had been fully reassigned, the lawyer didn't celebrate. He nodded once. That's it, he said. Now they've crossed into irreversible territory. Irreversible for them. He filed that afternoon. Not publicly, not theatrically, directly. The motion froze everything. Accounts, transfers, authorizations. Momentum stopped mid-step. And when momentum stops suddenly, people panic. The facility received notice first. That was intentional. Their tone changed overnight. Smiles tightened. Procedures were re-reviewed. Questions were redirected upward instead of answered. My son didn't call that day. The next day, his lawyer did. They asked for clarification, suggested a mutual resolution, requested time they no longer controlled. The trap had worked because it didn't look like one. It looked like business as usual, and when the paperwork they trusted became the thing that stopped them, they had no one to blame but themselves. Waiting is harder than action. Action gives you the illusion of control. Waiting forces you to sit with certainty and do nothing with it. Once the motion was filed, everything slowed down, not naturally, but defensively. The facility stopped making decisions. Staff began deferring questions they used to answer casually. Every request required confirmation from people who were suddenly very quiet. My son didn't visit. That silence told me more than any confrontation ever could. People who believe they're winning don't disappear. People who realize something has gone wrong do. The lawyer warned me about this phase. This is when they try to provoke you, he said, or disappear, or negotiate. Don't give them anything. So I waited. Days passed with no updates, no explanations, no movement. The administrative machinery that had rushed so eagerly before now creaked under its own caution. The facility manager stopped meeting my eyes. Nurses began addressing me more formally. Language changed, pending review, temporary hold, awaiting instruction. Those words replaced confidence. At night, I replayed conversations in my head, not to second-guess myself, but to remind myself why patience mattered. They would try to frame this as a misunderstanding. They would suggest compromise. They would imply stress, miscommunication, concern. None of that mattered anymore. The record existed. Everything that had happened was time-stamped, sequenced, traceable. Waiting wasn't passive. It was pressure. Because every hour that passed without resolution forced them to explain themselves to their lawyers, to the court, to each other. And explanations always reveal cracks. On the third day, I overheard a staff member on the phone outside my door. "Yes, the Guardian is asking if this can be expedited," she whispered. A pause. "No, the court placed a stay." A stay. That word didn't belong to them anymore. That evening, my son finally called. His voice sounded different. Not angry, not confident, measured. "Dad," he said, "we need to talk." I kept my tone even. "About what?" "This has gotten complicated," he replied. Complicated was the word people use when their plan stops working. "We just want to resolve this quickly," he added. Quickly. The same urgency, the same tell. "I'm comfortable waiting," I said. Silence. He hadn't expected that. After the call ended, I sat alone and understood something important. This was the first time since the door to my house had been locked that my silence wasn't being used against me. This time, it was working for me. Because waiting isn't weakness when the truth is already moving. It's leverage. Confidence returned to them before resolution ever did. That was the tell. The facility relaxed again, not fully, but enough. Staff stopped whispering. Procedures resumed their familiar rhythm. The tension that had crept into every hallway softened as if everyone had silently agreed this was going to blow over. People behave that way when they believe a problem has an expiration date. My son started visiting again. Not often, not warmly, but with the posture of someone checking on an investment he believed was stabilizing. "This will all be sorted out soon," he said during one visit, standing instead of sitting. "These things always look worse before they get better." Better for whom wasn't a question he felt obligated to answer. He spoke as if the court was a formality, as if the pause was a delay, not a threat, as if time still belonged to him. I talked to my attorney, he added casually. He says this happens all the time. Judges like compromise. Compromise. That word meant I would give something up so he could keep something he'd already taken. I nodded. Not agreement. Acknowledgement. He mistook it for submission. They all did. The facility manager stopped avoiding me. She resumed her polite efficiency, asked if I needed anything, commented on how well I seemed to be adjusting to what she never specified. One afternoon, I overheard her on the phone outside my door. Yes, she said, we expect the guardianship to be reaffirmed. There's been no indication otherwise. Reaffirmed. They weren't preparing for a challenge, they were preparing for validation. My son's lawyer called again. This time, his tone was different, friendly even. We're confident the court will see this was done in good faith, he said. Your son acted responsibly under difficult circumstances. Good faith. That phrase does a lot of work in legal conversations. It assumes intent without examining outcome. I said nothing. Silence unsettles people only when they're unsure. When they think they're winning, silence reassures them. They took my silence as acceptance. They began planning again. I heard staff mention timelines. I saw documents reappear on clipboards. I noticed the return of that familiar word, finalization. They were resuming momentum. That was exactly what the lawyer and I had anticipated. Because when people believe they've survived scrutiny, they stop being careful. They repeat themselves. They clarify too much. They reveal assumptions. My son leaned closer during one visit and lowered his voice. You know, he said, once the judge signs off, this all becomes permanent. Permanent. Not care. Not protection. Permanent control. He said it like reassurance. I looked at him calmly. We'll see. He smiled. A thin, satisfied expression. Yes, he said. We will. That was the moment I understood something essential. They thought the story was already written. They believed the court would rubber stamp what paperwork had already normalized. They thought the hardest part was over. They had no idea the first strike hadn't even landed yet. The days leading up to the hearing were strangely quiet. Not peaceful, not resolved. Quiet in the way a room goes silent just before someone says something that can't be taken back. No one pressured me anymore. No one rushed paperwork past my door. The system settled into a holding pattern, convinced it had already absorbed the shock and come out intact. That confidence created space. And space creates mistakes. Staff resumed small talk, mentioned schedules, referred to future plans as if they were already approved. The facility manager even asked casually whether I preferred to stay where I was or move once everything was finalized. Finalized. I answered neutrally. I haven't decided. She nodded, satisfied. She believed there was still time. My son stopped posturing and started reminiscing. Once this is over, he said during one visit, we can get back to normal. Normal. The word landed wrong. Normal would mean accepting what he had done and pretending it was care. Normal would mean silence. He talked about efficiency, about responsibility, about how hard decisions sometimes had to be made for family. I listened without interrupting. Inside, everything was still. That stillness wasn't fear, it was clarity. The lawyer called the night before the hearing. Tomorrow, he said, don't volunteer anything. Answer exactly what you're asked. Nothing more. I understand, I said. If they try to reframe the narrative, he continued, let them. We're not here to argue feelings. Only facts, I replied. He paused. Exactly. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because I expected victory, but because the waiting was over. There's a calm that comes when preparation is complete, when no more decisions need to be made, when the outcome is no longer something you can influence by worrying. The system around me believed it had stabilized the situation. They believed the pause meant approval was coming. They believed silence meant compliance. Tomorrow would prove how wrong they were, because calm doesn't always mean safety. Sometimes it means the last chance to stop digging. and no one on their side had realized the ground beneath them was already hollow. Module 7.1, First Strike. The first strike didn't come from me. That was important. If it had, they would have framed it as emotion. Retaliation, a confused old man lashing out because he didn't like being told what to do. Instead, it came from the record, from the same paperwork they trusted to protect them. The hearing opened with routine language, formalities, case numbers, a summary that sounded clean and orderly if you didn't know how much had been skipped to get there. My son's attorney spoke first. He described concern, responsibility. A son stepping in when his father could no longer manage on his own. He spoke confidently as if repetition had turned assumption into fact. The judge listened without interruption. Then my attorney stood. He didn't argue. He asked a question. Your Honor, he said, can we establish the exact date the respondent's assets were first accessed under guardianship authority? The courtroom shifted slightly. Not tension attention. My son's attorney answered without hesitation. He had rehearsed this. Within days of the appointment, he said, as is standard, before or after an independent capacity evaluation, my attorney asked. A pause. After the attorney replied. Or contemporaneous. Contemporaneous is the word people use when they don't want to commit. My attorney nodded once. And can the court be directed to the independent evaluation report? Another pause. This one longer. The attorney flipped through his binder. We have a medical referral, he said. And family statements. Not an evaluation, my attorney replied calmly. The judge leaned forward slightly. That's correct, the judge said. Where is the independent determination of incapacity? Silence. It was the first crack. My attorney continued, voice steady. So, to clarify, guardianship authority was granted. Assets were accessed, mail was redirected, and a residence transfer initiated, all before any neutral evaluation took place. He let the words sit. No emphasis, no accusation, just sequence. Sequence is lethal when it's wrong. My son's attorney objected. Procedural language, technicalities. The judge waved him off. I'm interested in the order of events, he said. That was it. The frame had shifted. This was no longer about intentions, it was about timing. My attorney introduced the first exhibit, a simple timeline. Dates, signatures, approvals. Each one tied to a document the court already recognized. Nothing sensational, just undeniable. My son glanced at his attorney, then back at the judge. Confidence drained from his posture. Not all at once, but enough. The judge turned to him directly. Mr. Harland, he said, why were financial controls enacted before your father was determined to be incapacitated? My son opened his mouth, closed it, then spoke. We were just trying to make sure things didn't fall apart, he said. Fall apart? The judge didn't respond. He looked back at the timeline. The first strike had landed, not with force, with clarity. And once clarity enters the room, everything built on assumptions starts to shake. Panic doesn't announce itself loudly in court. It leaks. My son's attorney began speaking faster. Sentences grew longer, more conditional, padded with phrases meant to soften what could no longer be denied. Out of an abundance of caution, with the best intentions, in a good faith effort, each phrase tried to replace sequence with motive. It didn't work. The judge asked another question, this time directed at the facility representative. Why was a residence transfer initiated prior to a completed evaluation? The manager cleared her throat. We were informed that informed by whom, the judge asked. She glanced sideways. Not at her attorney. At my son. That glance lasted less than a second. It was enough. My attorney didn't interrupt. He didn't capitalize on it. He waited, knowing that pressure works better when it's allowed to build on its own. The judge pressed again. Was this court informed that financial actions were being taken concurrently with medical assessments? The answer came out smaller than intended. No, Your Honor. The room changed temperature. My son shifted in his chair. His knee began to bounce, an old habit from childhood, one I hadn't seen in years. He caught himself and forced it still. Too late. The judge turned back to the timeline. So the court granted temporary authority based on representations of urgency and safety, he said slowly while material actions were taken that appear unrelated to immediate care. Appeared. The most dangerous word so far. My son's attorney objected again, this time more sharply. The judge didn't look at him. He looked at me. Mr. Harland, he asked, were you informed that your assets were being accessed at this stage? No, I said. Were you given an opportunity to contest those actions? No. Were you provided independent counsel before these steps were taken? No. Each answer landed without emphasis. Facts don't need help. The judge leaned back. My attorney introduced the next exhibit, not audio, not emails, just a bank notification, date stamped, Guardian authorized. Effective immediately. This authorization, my attorney said, was executed within 72 hours of the guardianship order. My son's attorney began speaking at the same time. The judge raised a hand. Counsel, he said, I need you to stop. That sentence carried more weight than any ruling, because it meant the court had stopped listening to explanations. Panic moved next to denial. My son spoke without being asked. We were under a lot of pressure, he said. I was trying to do the right thing. The judge looked at him steadily. Pressure does not excuse bypassing due process, he replied. Due process. That was the word my son had hoped would never come up. My attorney said nothing. He didn't need to. The room was no longer balanced. Every attempt to justify only reinforced the imbalance. Because panic doesn't make new arguments. It repeats old ones more desperately. And repetition in a record looks exactly like confirmation. The kill shot wasn't loud. It didn't come with raised voices or dramatic objections. No one slammed a hand on the table. No one stormed out of the room. It came when the court stopped asking what had happened and started asking why it had been hidden. My attorney stood and introduced the final exhibit, an audio file. He didn't describe it. He didn't summarize it. He simply said, Your Honor, this recording was made during a conversation between the guardian and the facility administrator. It speaks for itself. The judge nodded once. Play it. The room went still. My son's voice filled the courtroom, calm, familiar, confident. I don't want this dragging out. The paperwork should already be done. A pause. Then the facility manager. We can fast-track the remaining documentation, but we'll need your sign-off today. My son again. That's fine. Once the assets are consolidated, things tend to settle. Settle. The recording ended without commentary. No one moved. My son stared straight ahead, jaw clenched, as if the sound had come from somewhere else. The facility manager looked down at her hands and didn't look up again. The judge didn't speak right away. He read through the timeline one last time, compared dates, cross-checked signatures. Then he looked at my son. This court, he said evenly, does not exist to facilitate asset consolidation. The words were precise, deliberate, final. He turned to the file. Temporary guardianship is hereby terminated effective immediately. My son inhaled sharply like the air had been knocked out of him. All financial actions taken under this authority are void pending investigation. The facility's attorneys started to rise. The judge raised his hand. And this matter, he continued, is referred to the appropriate oversight bodies for review of potential abuse of process. Abuse of process. The phrase landed heavier than any accusation. The judge turned to me. Mr. Harland, he said, you are restored full control of your medical and financial decisions. Restored, not granted. Restored. I nodded once. I didn't look at my son. I didn't need to. Everything he had built, every shortcut, every assumption, every quiet coordination had collapsed under its own weight, paper by paper, word by word. The judge called the next case. The room began to move again, but the damage was done. Because in a system built on records, the truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs to be played once. The first thing that surprised me wasn't relief. It was quiet. Not the controlled quiet of the facility, not the procedural silence of a courtroom. This was something else, a space where no one was watching me, documenting me, or waiting for permission to speak on my behalf. The guardianship ended on paper immediately. The consequences unfolded more slowly. Accounts were unfrozen within days. Access restored one institution at a time, each call beginning with an apology that sounded rehearsed but carried real urgency. People who had once refused to speak to me without authorization now addressed me directly carefully, as if recalibrating their understanding of who I was. The facility moved faster. I was discharged within 48 hours. No ceremony, no explanation, just signatures, reversed belongings returned, and a quiet acknowledgement that I no longer belonged there. The administrator avoided eye contact when she handed me my phone. "Take care," she said. I did not reply. I went home alone. The house was exactly as I had left it, and completely different. The door opened with my key. The air smelled faintly stale. Dust had settled where it never used to. I walked through each room slowly, not checking for damage, but for recognition. Every object still knew me. Every corner remembered its purpose. My son did not call. His lawyer did, once. He spoke carefully, mentioned misunderstandings, stressed that emotions had been high, suggested that family reconciliation might be healthiest for everyone. I declined. The investigation began quietly. Oversight bodies don't announce themselves. They request records. They schedule interviews. They follow timelines. The facility was reviewed, the process scrutinized. My son was asked to explain decisions he had once described as routine. I wasn't asked to participate beyond providing documents. That mattered. The record spoke for itself. Neighbors reached out cautiously. Some apologized for not questioning what they had seen. Others avoided the subject entirely. I didn't correct anyone. Correction wasn't the point anymore. My son sent a message 2 weeks later. It wasn't an apology. It was a justification. He wrote that he had done what he thought was right, that things had gone too far, that the system had overreacted. He ended by saying he hoped someday I would understand. I read the message once, then I archived it. Justice doesn't always come with satisfaction. Sometimes it comes with clarity. And clarity changes what you're willing to accept moving forward. I don't celebrate what happened. There is nothing to celebrate when a father has to prove his existence to his own child. Life returned to something like normal, but not the version I remembered. It was quieter now, cleaner, more deliberate. I changed the locks, not because I was afraid, but because trust once broken doesn't belong in the same space anymore. I reviewed every document, updated beneficiaries, replaced advisors, built redundancies into systems I once believed only needed good faith to function. Good faith, I learned, is not protection. Distance is. My son never apologized. He stopped calling after his lawyer advised him to, not out of shame, out of strategy. Silence, when chosen, is its own kind of admission. I don't wonder what he tells people now. It doesn't matter. What matters is that I finished my life the way I started it, responsible for my own decisions, accountable to no one but the law and my conscience. People ask me sometimes if I regret taking it that far. I tell them no. Because the moment someone decides they can remove your freedom for your own good, they have already decided you no longer belong to yourself. And if you don't defend that line when it's crossed quietly, you won't recognize yourself when it's gone completely. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight in the hallway. I didn't beg for understanding. I waited. I documented. I let the truth speak in the only language the system respects. Paper. Procedure. Proof. That's how I got my life back. Not by being louder, but by being undeniable.